Today in Bloomburrow, we get a busted bunny baling some hay, a super wordy mouse, a new green commander stable, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Bloomburrow spoilers. So we've reached the end of week 1 of Bloomburrow spoilers, and we have some really exciting stuff to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it, start breaking down some sweet new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Bloomburrow. First up today, we get an absurd new green commander staple. Our last season, the green season in Season of Gathering. So it's a 6-mana green sorcery. It's a mythic. You choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. You can choose each mode more than once if you want to. For 1 paw, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. It gains Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. For 2 paws, you choose Artifact or Enchantment. Destroy all permanents of the chosen type. For 3 paws, you draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. This card is going to be an ultra staple in green decks and commander. This is going to be one of the most played commander cards from the entire set. It is absolutely ridiculous. When you think about what this card does, its first mode, couldn't find a perfect comparison, but it's kind of like a Gaia's Gift, not quite Gaia's Gift, but you put a counter on a thing and you give it Vigilance and Trample. You could choose it 5 times and like pump your entire team. You could also choose the same creature more than once if you wanted to and make one creature really big. Also worth mentioning here, and I know why they did this, I'm not sure that I like it, but it's notable that that mode doesn't actually target the creature that you control. You just put it on a creature, and why Wizards did this, I'm 99% sure, is because let's say you ended up in a situation where you chose like destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, so that's 4 paws, and then your last mode was put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Since there's only one target of that effect, if your opponent killed the creature that you were targeting, it would fizzle the entire effect of the spell. So I think Wizards wanted to avoid any blowout potential, although it is a little weird that a very targeted style effect doesn't actually target. I don't know, let me know what you think of this. Is it worth it to avoid the blowouts? Is it awkward to have non-targeted wording on the card for that reason alone? But if you think of the rest of the card, you could Bane of Progress. If you choose the 2-paw mode twice, you could choose artifacts and enchantments, although a lot of times you only really need to get rid of one of those. Some commander games, you might have a bunch of artifacts and enchantments, but a lot of times you just need to get rid of the artifacts against the artifact player, or just need to get rid of the enchantments against the enchantment player. So I think a lot of times you're gonna like half Bane of Progress and get like a Back to Nature, or get a Vandal Blast, and then also draw a bunch of cards. The last mode is essentially Whiskervale's Expertise. You don't get to play a card for free, but we see these draw cards equal the greatest power creature you control be some of the most played green cards in all of Commander. It's really ramp spells, and then these spells are like the second most played, because as we talk about in Commander, what you want to be doing is making more mana than your opponents, drawing more cards than your opponents, and this is a great way to just refill your entire hand. Since green puts such big creatures on the battlefield, it's going to draw you a ton of cards, and it's worth pointing out, if you just want to go max card draw, you can use the 1-paw mode to grow your biggest creature even further, and then the 3-paw mode to make sure you're going to draw as many cards as possible. So I think in Commander, this is just an auto-include in most decks that are playing green. I guess there's probably some weird edge cases where you're not playing a lot of creatures, although that's kind of what green does, but most green decks are going to want to play this card, and it's going to be really, really good in those decks. As far as Standard is concerned, I'm a little bit skeptical. If we end up in a world where blowing up all the artifacts or enchantments is really relevant, maybe this card could see some play in Standard. We're not really in that place right now, I don't think. And in Standard, it's just kind of risky. Yes, drawing cards is great, but your opponent could have a Shouldered Out or something, and just drawing a bunch of cards might actually kill you instead of help you. So I don't think this card is especially designed to see Standard play. I hope I'm wrong, because it's a really cool card, but I think this is pretty specifically targeted to be the best green commander card in the set. In Commander, as I mentioned before, if you just look on EDH Rec, it's the most played green cards in the format. It's ramp spells like Rampant's Growth and Nature's Lures, and then it's Whiskervale's Expertise, Return to the Wild Speaker, these mass card draw effects, and I think this is on par with something like Whiskervale's Expertise. Sure, you're not going to cast something for free, but it's the same amount of mana, and you get the upside of flexibility, right? Maybe you blow up all the artifacts, blow up all the enchantments, pump one of your creatures. So I think this card is just the new best version of this effect. Actually, maybe second. second best. Return of the Wild Speaker is actually really strong because it's an instant and it can do like the weird overrun thing. But I think this is at least on par with Rishkar's Expertise, which is literally one of the most played commander cards in the entire format. So I expect this card will be pretty pricey. It's at Mythic. It's going to go in a lot of decks. This is going to be one of the chase commander cards from the entire set. So Season of Gatherings, it's designed to be just a really great commander card. And if you like drawing cards and you like winning games, this is the kind of card that you're going to want in a lot of your green commander decks. We also got the wordiest mouse bard in the history of Magic in Whiskervale Forerunner. So it is a 4-mana 3/4. It's a mouse bard, and then it has Valiant, and its Valiant ability says, when it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them. You may put it on the battlefield if it's your turn. If you don't put it on the battlefield, you can put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I'm actually impressed that Wizards managed to fit that many words on the card. Also worth noting, there's no enters in there. So this isn't a case where getting rid of enters the battlefield helped them fit more text on the card. They just managed to put an entire paragraph on here. I will say, I think this card, despite its massive wall of text, actually plays very simply. Essentially, whenever you target this with something, once a turn, you look at your top 5, for a creature mana value 3 or less. If it's your turn, you can put it right into play if you want to. If it's not your turn, you have to put it in your hand. If it is your turn, you can still choose to put it in your hand, although most of the time you're not going to want to do that. And then the rest go on the bottom. I think this card is actually very strong. It's kind of this weird white Collected Company or Kyla's reconstruction in the right deck. Yes, you do need to be built around it, right? You need ways to trigger its Valiant ability, but if you can do that, it's pretty easy for this to be a Coco or a Kyla's reconstruction, and if this sticks around, it can be even better than that, because you can be doing this once during your turn, once during your opponent's turn, and generating just a ridiculous amount of value and card advantage. So it works really well with mice, like that's kind of the obvious. So the question for this card in the mouse deck is it going to be too expensive? Like, do you want a 4-drop in the mouse deck? Because the mouse deck looks so incredibly aggressive that I'm not actually sure if you want 4-drops at all, but if you do want a 4-drop, this is a really good one, because it works with like Manifold Mouse, Raging Battle Mouse. They're incidentally cards that you're going to have in your deck, and they just happen to trigger Valiant really easily, and they're cheap enough that you can put them into play. So this might be like a mouse sideboard card for the grindier matchups. Maybe the deck is wanting to go big enough to get to 4 mana, but it works really well in mice. Plus, you can target it with Monstrous Rage, or Skrelv can repeatedly target it. So if you want to build around this fact, there's a lot of ways of doing it. You can also just play it as like a generic value card. It kind of reminds me in a weird way of Sarah Paragon, is this 4-drop that generates a huge amount of value by letting you recast cheap things from your graveyard. Whiskervale Forerunner, kind of similar. You don't have to use the graveyard, and you do need ways to target it, so you get an extra hoop to jump through, but it's going to generate card advantage right from your library. So I imagine you could play this with like Guardian Agurapur, which enters the battlefield, it's going to blink something, you can target the Whiskervale Forerunner, put a thing into play from your deck. Also worth mentioning that if you blink this, you reset its once per turn restriction. You play it with like Siege Veteran targets, Skrelv targets, so I think this could be a really good top-end card for some sort of like small mid-range white deck. Maybe it's the top end of like a big aggro white deck. As I mentioned before, really sweet blink effects. This might be more of like a commander thing than a standard thing, but if you Whiskervale Forerunner, you can like ephemera it, get a 3-drop from your deck, put it into play, and then you can target it again with something else, trigger its ability again, because it's technically a new version of Whiskervale Forerunner. Worth keeping in mind in commander in specific, if you're playing like some sort of Blink Soul Herder style deck where you're already playing these blink effects and a bunch of cheap creatures, then it goes up in value even more. As far as commander is concerned, seems really good in any sort of heroic deck, something like Feather or Annex and Symede, where you're going to be targeting your stuff regularly anyways. And then there's other options like 8.5 Tails has an ability that easily lets you target your creatures for just 2 mana. So if you're playing a bunch of cheap white creatures and you're playing 8.5 Tails, this is just a very consistent source of card advantage, where for 2 mana you're putting a 3-drop into play, then on your opponent's turn for 2 mana you're drawing a 3-drop. Just keep chaining through your deck again and again and again. Works really well with Mother of Ruin style effects. Like, hey, imagine if you're playing a white weenie style commander deck, these cards are going to be some of the best cards in your deck, because they're really good standalone cards anyway, right, to just protect your creatures, but then they're also going to let you trigger your Whiskervale Forerunner at will on your opponent's turn or during your turn. So Whiskervale Forerunner, The card seems really strong. I know it's got this huge wall of text, but I think it's actually going to play pretty straightforwardly. I wish there was a way to word it a little bit simpler somehow, but after reading this card a bunch of times, I'm not really sure there was a way to do it. I guess the only way you could really do it is get rid of the during your opponent's turn restriction. That would cut some text out of it, but that would also make the card stronger, and it already seems pretty strong. So this is the card that I think has a chance to see play. We're going to have to wait and see if the right deck emerges. Do mice want it? Is there a blink deck? But if you build around this in the right deck, this seems like it could be a staple level 4 drop. We also got a card that I am actually kind of surprised that Wizards printed. This is my pick for most powerful commander from the set so far, and it's a card that I think has some interesting, but maybe more against the odds style, constructed implications. In Baylen the Haymaker, notice the pun in the name, you're Baylen the Hay, very good. A lot of people seem to miss that, but it's a very cringy C-tier level pun, but Baylen the Haymaker, 3 mana Naya 4/3, so reasonable stats. It's a legendary rabbit warrior. It says you can tap 2 untapped tokens you control to make a mana of any color. You can tap 3 untapped tokens you control to draw a card. You can tap 4 untapped tokens you control to put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains trample until end of turn. Notice, this does not say creature tokens, so you could be tapping foods and clues and junks and bloods, any of these very easy to make cheap non-creature tokens, and just getting a ridiculous amount of value out of this card. If you think about what this card is, it's kind of almost Jaheira. It makes less mana than Jaheira, right? Because Jaheira, you just can tap your tokens for a green mana. This, you need to tap 2 tokens to make 1 mana, but it makes up for this drawback by also letting you draw cards. It's essentially Sky Strike Officer's ability, but for any token, and then it feels a little bit of like Kumana Tyrant of Orzhaka, what it is for Merfolk, where you can like grow your creatures too. And this card, I think, is just absolutely ridiculous, at least in Commander, because as we've talked about before, what do you want to do in Commander? Draw cards, make mana. Draw cards, make mana. Baylen does both, and it does it really easily and rewards you for playing a lot of really good cards anyway. As far as Standard is concerned, it'll be interesting to see just how good this card actually is. It does work really well with the rabbit theme, because it's so much about going wide and making tokens. Like Season of the Burrow makes 5 tokens, Hop to It makes 3 tokens, maybe you can throw in some Mondrax or Osier Tox to make even more tokens. And then Baylen's kind of a ridiculous payoff. When you're getting all these tokens on the battlefield, this can generate so much mana, draw so many cards. It also, once you get back to Commander, becomes just kind of insane. Like, your Dockside Extortionist makes a ton of treasures, but instead of sacking those treasures, you can just tap them to make mana with Baylen, or tap them to draw cards with Baylen. Same with Bootlegger Stash, or clue tokens you're making with Tireless Tracker. It's so easy to build around this card. The other place I'm kind of excited about this, and this is like janky brew around potential, but we played some decks recently that make a ton of tokens. In Standard, we played a Worldwaker's Helm deck that just like was built around like token limiting arena. In a deck like that, adding Baylen to the mix is so incredibly ridiculous. It turns the deck into kind of this huge combo deck where you can just draw your entire deck and make all the mana, grow your Baylen a ridiculous amount of times. So that's one possibility. In Modern, and again, I don't think this is like top tier competitive stuff, but it works really well with Academy Manufacturer. When you make a clue or food or a treasure, you get one of each instead. That's going to give you a ton of token fodder to be able to work with Baylen. You can even combo off with this if you just stack up things that make extra tokens and then throw in some Anointed Processions or Doubling Seasons. It's pretty easy to build this huge snowball where Baylen's just going to generate a ridiculous amount of value. Like, for example, maybe you get a Samwise Gamgee going, right? Where whenever you have a non-token creature ETB make a food, you throw an Academy Manufacturer into the mix, so you're also making a treasure and a clue when this happens. Then you throw in like an Anointed Procession, so you're doubling those tokens, and then you play something like Whitemane Lion, that when it comes into play for 2 mana, you can just bounce it back to your hand, or another creature, but bounce it back to your hand. If you get a setup like this, you're essentially making 2 treasures every time you cast Whitemane Lion, so you can cast it as many times as you want, but you're also going to be getting, thanks to Academy Manufacturer, a food token and a clue token, which means you can draw your entire deck with Baylen. You can make as much mana as you want with Baylen. You can make Baylen infinitely big, so it seems relatively easy to turn this into an infinite mana, infinite card draw, infinitely big creature combo piece. There's even more straightforward combos like Goblin Warrens with Anointed Procession. Goblin Warrens, 3 mana red enchantment. You can pay 3, sack 2 goblins to put 3 goblins into play. You need an Anointed Procession to double this up, but essentially you sack 2 goblins to make 6 goblins. Those 6 goblins you can tap to make 3 mana, which is enough to activate the Goblin Warrens again. So you sack 2 of those goblins to make 6 goblins thanks to Anointed Procession, and then you tap them all to do it again, so you make infinite goblin tokens. If you throw in an additional piece like a doubling season or something, then you're making infinite mana, infinite card draw. It's so easy to go infinite with this card. So Baylen the Haymaker, the card is kind of nuts. Every time I've played with Jaheira, I have come away feeling like Jaheira is a broken Magic card. And this is pretty close to a Jaheira that also draws cards and Voltron kills someone by becoming this huge trampling threat. So I think that Baylen gonna be one of the most popular and most busted commanders from the set, and I'm excited for the janky brew around potential in formats like Modern. In Standard, we'll have to wait and see. It does work well with the rabbit theme. Do rabbits want to be Naya? How does that all work out? But this card is really, really scary, and one to keep in mind, it is an incredibly powerful effect. Next up, we have Wishing Well, a new blue artifact, which I think might have a few too many restrictions to really be good anywhere, or at least outside of Commander. So 4-mana artifact, you tap it and put a coin counter on it. When you do, you can cast an instant or sorcery card with mana value equal to the number of coin counters on it from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If the spell would be put in your graveyard, you exile it instead. Activate only as a sorcery. So essentially, you play this for 4 mana, you tap it at sorcery speed, and you can cast exactly a 1-mana spell from your graveyard. The next turn, you can tap it again, cast exactly a 2-mana spell from your graveyard, then a 3-mana the next turn, a 4-mana the next turn. It seems like this card's going to be tricky to use because it's not equal to or less than the number of counters on it. You're going to need a very specific chain of spells for this to actually do much of anything. So I think that's my biggest concern for the card. And then the sorcery speed restriction, it makes sense. It would kind of be annoying if you could just keep tapping this during your opponent's turn to recast counter spells or something, but it does power down the card even more. So Wishing Well, I think it's supposed to be like a birthing pod for spells in your graveyard, which is a cool idea. I'm just not sure it's going to be strong enough. It kind of reminds me a little bit of As Foretold, but the thing about As Foretold is it has the X or less text on it. So with As Foretold, even though your counters are building up, you can always cast a 1-mana spell or a 0-mana spell, no matter how many counters are going to be on it. Wishing Well is not going to do that. And with As Foretold, the reason that saw play in Modern was primarily to cast something like Living End or Restore Balance, these 0-mana value effects, but Wishing Well can't do that because it's always going to have at least 1 counter on it once you tap it, but Wishing Well is just never going to be able to cast these cards. There is like potential to chain together. Like if you look at the ceiling, it can be cool, right? Imagine like you get a full graveyard, there's no graveyard heat, you stick your 4-mana artifact, you tap it and lightning bolt something, then the next turn you tap it and expressive iteration, then the next turn you Archmage's Charm and draw some cards or steal something, then you cryptic the next turn to bounce something. Setting up that actual scenario, though, just seems like such a stretch, and there's going to be a lot of games where your 4-mana artifact just isn't doing anything, so it's really hard for me to see how this could be a competitive card, especially since it doesn't do the As Foretold, like Living End Restore Balance shenanigans. Like, without those shenanigans thrown in, it becomes even harder to see how it could work. The place that this could maybe see play is in commander decks, like Spellslinger commander decks. I'm still not sure that it'll actually be worth it, but if your deck is just super full of spells, because you're a Niv deck or a Kess deck or a Viren deck or any of the million Spellslinger commanders, if that's what your deck is doing, maybe this could be fun to run. I still don't know if it's actually going to be worth it. It's pretty slow and there's a lot of restrictions, and if you don't have the right things in your graveyard, it doesn't really do anything, but it could be fun to try in Spellslinger commander. So Wishing Well, it looks a little bit like Spell Birthing Pod from the graveyard, but I think that in practice, there's just too many restrictions and a few too many safety valves for it to really work outside of Commander. And in Commander, I'm not sure if I'd rather play this over a lot of the other options, especially since it's a Spellslinger card, but it's not a spell itself. And the bar is pretty high. If the theme of your deck is cast as many instants or sorceries as possible, to be a non-instant or sorcery, like it's very hard to find room for a random artifact in the deck. So I'm kind of thinking this ends up being a cool card with cool art that doesn't see a lot of play, but maybe there's something I'm missing. We also got Valley Floodcaller, which is a pretty exciting otter wizard. So it's a 3-mana 2/2 with flash. It says you can cast non-creature spells as though they had flash, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, birds, frogs, otters, and rats you control get +1/+1 until end of turn, untap them. If this sounds familiar, it's kind kind of like a Jeskai Ascendancy, only for birds, otters, rats, and frogs, that is also like a uptick to Fairy Time Raveler or Wizards of Thay, where you can cast your non-creature spells at instant speed. I think this card is mostly a combo piece. That's what I'm envisioning with this card, is essentially working like a Jeskai Ascendancy combo piece. So how do you combo with this card? Well, first you need creatures of the proper types, which is birds, frogs, otters, and rats, that are going to be able to tap to make mana. So in standard, we have like Poison Dart Frog, if you can flip it around, Sunbird's Effigy, Restless Anchor Mage, once you fire it up, is technically a bird. Mockingbird can potentially copy something that makes mana while also still being a bird. So if you can get down a few things that make mana, what you can do is cast like a 1 mana instant or sorcery. Well, first float all your mana, tap all your creatures for mana, then cast like a 1 mana instant or sorcery, which will untap all of your birds, frogs, otters, and rats. So now you can tap them again for mana, then cast another cheap instant or sorcery. And if you can keep chaining together cantrips, you can't just kind of churn through your deck, make a huge amount of mana, and use that to win the game. And you're also, remember, pumping your team along the way. That's how Jeskai Ascendancy normally wins, is eventually you just cast so many spells that you turn your creatures into one-shot kill threats. In one of the upsides of Valley Floodcaller, well, it does have a big restriction as far as the creature types you need to play. Being able to do this all at instant speed and flash this in instant speed is actually pretty exciting. So I don't know if this deck would be competitive, but I'm excited to try to build some sort of Jeskai Ascendancy combo deck in standard with Valley Floodcaller. It's also possible that this could show up in Jeskai Ascendancy in older formats. Once you get back to older formats, you actually have like Birds of Paradise, which is just naturally a bird that taps to make mana that works really well with what Valley Floodcaller is trying to do, supports the combo easily. It could maybe even in the right build be like a backup Jeskai Ascendancy in the Pioneer Jeskai Ascendancy decks. Not going to work with Sylvan Carry added, so you'd have to change up the mana dorks, which might be too much of a drawback, but getting more Ascendancies in the deck and being able to combo at instant speed does seem powerful. There's also just straight up easy combos with this deck. So one of the differences between Valley Floodcaller and like Teferi Time Raveler or Wizards of Thay is it lets you cast any non-creature spell as though it had flash, rather than just instants or sorceries. So what you can do with Valley Floodcaller is you can use a card like Retraction Helix to target the Floodcaller, which is an otter. Then you can tap the Floodcaller to bounce Mox Amber. Then the Mox Amber you can cast, and that'll untap the Valley Floodcaller because it's a non-creature spell, and Valley Floodcaller is an otter. Then you can float the mana from the Mox Amber, assuming you have a legend, and then you tap Floodcaller to bounce it again. So essentially make infinite mana as long as you have a legend on the battlefield with a Retraction Helix effects and a Mox Amber, which is kind of something we've seen with Jeskai Ascendancy combos in the past. So there's a lot of ways that this card can actually combo off. In standard, it's going to be hard to make those combos work, but it plays really well with just the theme of otters. Otters is all about prowess, all about casting a ton of spells, reducing the cost of your spells, damaging your opponent when you cast your spells, and Valley Floodcaller just fits that plan pretty nicely. It's a way to pump your team, it's a way you can play during your opponent's turn, so I think this card definitely is good in otters. I don't know how good otters is going to be, but it works really well with the Spellslinger theme. In Commander, I think that Valley Floodcaller could be good enough in just any Spellslinger deck, but I think it's going to be at its best in Spellslinger decks that specifically care about casting stuff during your opponent's turn. Stuff like Anhilo, for example, rewards you for the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn. In Valley Floodcaller is a way that you can be casting sorceries during your opponent's turn to get even more value out of your commander, but really, I think you could jam this in any Spellslinger style deck and probably get enough value out of it. So Valley Floodcaller, this card's actually pretty exciting. As a Jeskai Ascendancy on a body with flash that gives your stuff flash, even with the downside of only working with pretty niche creature types, I think this card has a lot of combo potential, should see some commander play in Spellslinger decks, and might make otters into a thing in standard. We also got For the Common Good. So For the Common Good, a green sorcery. It says create X tokens that are copies of target token you control. Then tokens you control gain indestructible until your next turn, and you gain 1 life for each token you control. So For the Common Good, it's essentially full flowering with some twists on it. It doesn't technically say populate, but it really works the same way. It's got the same mana cost. You get the upside of making your stuff indestructible until your next turn. So even though it's a sorcery, your stuff's still going to be protected during your opponent's turn, and then you get to gain some life along the way. I think the use of For the Common Good is almost going to be exactly like full flowering. In standard, it's worth pointing out when you consider how this card scales, where to get 1 copy, you need 3 mana. To get 2 copies, you need 5 mana. To get 3 copies, you need 7 mana, which means it's pretty slow and expensive. Just using this to copy like a random 1/1 token, not going to be very exciting, right? Like, it's just not worth the amount of mana if you're copying a 1/1 rabbit or something. But it does play really well with the offspring mechanic, which is a way you can get token copies of pretty powerful effects, like making a whole bunch of War Leaders or Crustacean Mages or Thundertrap Trainers seems actually very powerful because you're getting these strong abilities, even though it's just a 1/1. It also works really well with stuff that can make token copies of bigger threats. C-Double. We've seen this making token Atraxas in Italies. Molten Duplication can make a token copy of any artifact or creature you control. Rotodrobic makes token copies of legends that die. In decks like this, for the common good, can do some ridiculous things where you're getting like super cheap discounted copies of some of the most powerful creatures in the entire game. Also, very cute with like Roxanne. Roxanne makes token copies of Meteorite, then you can use for the common good to copy your Meteorites a bunch of times, deal a bunch of damage, maybe win the game. Although I do wonder if this is just like worse than Doppelgang. I know it's like a little bit cheaper, but Doppelgang is just so much more flexible. Although it's worth pointing out that they do kind of play good together. I don't know how many of these big X spells we can fit in a Doppelgang deck, but you can use Doppelgang to make token copies of anything, and then you get a little discount to copy those token copies with for the common good and make them indestructible and gain some life. So I don't know, Doppelgang is one of my favorite cards in Standard, so we're definitely going to have to try some sort of Doppelgang for the common good deck. How do we make all these expensive spells fit in the same deck? I'm not really sure. In Commander, I think you play this pretty much exactly like you play Flowering. If you're playing a deck that's built around making big tokens, like Gyred or Tristani, these populate commanders, or like Volo makes token copies of whatever you want, Bernard makes token copies, Adrix and Niv makes tons of copies, then I think this is a really nice inclusion in your deck. It's basically full Flowering, but a little bit better. You get some little bonuses out of it. So if you're a deck that's playing full Flowering, you probably just play for the common good 2, and then you got 2 copies instead of just 1, but it doesn't really change anything because it's pretty much exactly the same card of full Flowering, which is a little bit upside thrown in. In the world of lower rarity cards, we got 2 that deserve a shout out today, starting with Long River's Pull. So Long River's Pull, double blue instant, counter target creature spell, and then you can promise a gift of a card. If you do, you can counter any spell instead. So Long River's Pull, it's sort of like a harder to cast Essence Scatter that if you gift it turns into a legit counter spell. I think this might be a playable card. Like, I think that obviously you don't want to give your opponent the gift, like countering their thing and giving them a card back means you're kind of ending up down a card in the exchange, but still countering just a creature spell is relevant enough. And then in a pinch, your opponent's about to sunfall your board and you're going to lose. Well, giving your opponents a card, you know, is better than having that happen. So I think this could be a standard playable counter spell, although I don't know, we still have No More Lies, which is really strong. We are losing Make Disappear at rotation, so maybe this is like a Make Disappear replacement. Regardless, this is of a power level that is worth keeping in mind in Standard. I don't know if it'll be like a Standard staple, but I think it's good enough to see play. The other thing that I absolutely love about this card, in Commander in specific, is it is like the most brutal Arcane Denial of our time. So Arcane Denial sees a lot of play in Commander because you counter a spell, you get a card out of it, and you give whoever got their spell counter 2 cards. So it's like a counter spell that doesn't put you down a card and doesn't feel as bad. Sometimes when you get hit by Arcane Denial, you're like, okay, at least I'm getting 2 cards out of it. So it's a much less brutal counter spell. Long River's Pull is somehow like a much more brutal counter spell because of how gift a card works. So when you counter a spell with gift a card, you don't have to gift the card to the person whose spell you countered. So let's say I counter a Crim spell. It is perfectly legal for me to give Richard the card off of Long River's Pull. So it's a way that you can blow out someone with a counter, and rather than being super nice with Arcane Denial, you can intentionally be super mean and like do the rub-in thing and not give them a replacement card. You also could use it like in Arcane Denial and give it to the person whose spell you countered to make it less of a feel bad if you're worried about like making an enemy at the table. I also want to give a shout out to Wizards because I think gift is almost a perfect Commander mechanic. This is how I want to see Wizards design mechanics for Commander. As far as I'm concerned, this is almost everything you want out of a mechanic that is designed with Commander in mind. I think there's a misconception that people think Wizards shouldn't consider Commander at all when they're designing cards, which is silly. Commander's super popular, and Wizards should keep it in mind when they're designing cards. But what I don't like with Commander design is the super, like, clumsy, ham-fisted, just staple commander on it, like fierce guardianship or even free running. Those mechanics that have to like refer to commander itself, they just feel so clumsy and bad and forced and narrow. But Gift a Card is like so perfect. It works in non-commander formats. So these are cards that we were just talking about could probably see some standard play, but they're even better in commander because you have 3 different opponents. It's a mechanic that's going to keep the entire table engaged. It plays off the multiplayer nature of the format where you can give the card to whoever you want. It's not self-referential. There's no, if you control a commander, then I do a thing. Like, there's nothing like that going on. So I just love how they design this mechanic. So shout out to Wizards for designing a mechanic that's really good for commander, that doesn't feel so clumsy and ham-fisted and shoehorned into being good in the format. I hope we see more of these in the future. We also got Plumecreed Escort, which I gotta shout out because I think it's actually a pretty good card. 2-mana 2/1 flash flying. When it enters, target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. It's basically Rattle Chains, minus the text that lets you cast all of your spirits with flash, but plus the ability to protect any creature. And we've seen that 2/1 flash flyers tend to be pretty good. Right now, Fury Mastermind, one of the better cards in Standard. I think Plumecreed Escort could serve that purpose in Standard in some sort of flashy, flyery style deck. This is an efficient creature that can chip in for some damage in the air and protect your best threat from a targeted removal spell. So I think this card doesn't need to be a bird card or anything like that. It's just a good card in some sort of like Esper midrange style deck with a bunch of creatures to protect and some counter spells that you want to play at instant speed. Finally today, a bit of draft chaff that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. And anyway, that brings us to the end of not just our Bloomburrow spoilers for today, but our first week of Bloomburrow spoilers. Next week, we'll be back with more main set stuff and then all 4 Commander precons coming later in the week. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. But let me know what you think. Which cards are you most hyped about? How busted is that new Rabbit Legend? That card seems ridiculous. What are you building with these cards? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back either tomorrow or Monday, depending on how many spoilers we get, with even more Bloomburrow spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Mucha Brew, where we brought back some Trina Spears and Chalice to the Voids in Modern.